The thing about a bespoke suit is the feeling it gives you, a kind of modern-day armor. It wasn't just the thread count of the Italian wool or the perfect break of the trousers over my handmade leather shoes. It was the weight of it, the quiet statement it made when I walked into a room. It said I belonged. It said I was a winner in a city that only worships winners. My corner office on the 54th floor was another piece of that armor, a glass-walled sanctuary looking down on the chaos of Manhattan. I saw the city not as a collection of people, but as a circuit board, a complex network of capital flows, assets, and liabilities. I was one of the few who understood its language, who could manipulate its currents. I was a senior analyst at one of the biggest investment firms in the world, a master of a universe that ran on caffeine, ambition, and a complete disregard for the concept of enough. Enough was a mythical creature, a word for lesser men. My income wasn't just a salary. It was a scoreboard, and I was running up the numbers with a relentless pathological focus. This focus had bought me the armor, the office, the penthouse apartment with a view that made God feel like a neighbor. It bought my wife the couture she wore to the charity galas and the Range Rover she used to ferry our 2 children between their private school and their various expensive after-school activities. We were the perfect picture of Wall Street success, a portrait painted in hues of wealth and privilege. My wife was beautiful, elegant, a perfect partner for the life I had built. She was the CEO of our domestic life, managing the household staff, the social calendar, and the children's futures with the same ruthless efficiency I applied to a leveraged buyout. Our marriage, I see now, was a kind of a startup in itself, a joint venture. My role was to provide the capital, an ever-increasing stream of it. Her role was to manage the assets and present the public face of our success. We were a great team, as long as the stock market was trending upwards. The children were like prized acquisitions, extensions of my success. A son at a top-tier prep school, already being groomed for the Ivy League. A daughter whose equestrian hobby cost more per year than my father's entire annual salary when I was growing up. I loved them, of course I did, but it was a distant, abstract love. I was the provider of the ecosystem in which they thrived, but I was rarely a participant in it. My real family was the blinking green and red lights of the ticker, the adrenaline-fueled roar of the trading floor, the silent, deadly dance of high-stakes negotiations. My life was a series of complex financial instruments, and I understood them perfectly. I understood derivatives, credit default swaps, and algorithmic trading strategies. What I didn't understand was the growing silence at my own dinner table, the look of quiet resignation in my wife's eyes, or the fact that my son knew more about my public persona from financial news channels than from actual conversations with me. The deal that ended it all was presented as the opportunity of a lifetime. It was a massive, cross-border merger of 2 pharmaceutical giants, a deal so complex it involved shell corporations, intricate debt structuring, and a level of risk management that was more art than science. My mentor, the man who had brought me into the firm, the one I respected and trusted implicitly, put me at the head of the analytics team. He called it my coronation, the final step that would solidify my legacy at the firm and set me up for a level of passive income that would make my current life look like a dress rehearsal. The pressure was immense, the hours brutal. I practically lived in my office for 3 months, sleeping on a cot, fueled by takeout and the intoxicating thrill of the deal. I was in my element, a high-functioning sociopath navigating a world of pure numbers. My wife complained about my absence, but the complaints were muted, tempered by the promise of the colossal bonus that awaited me at the end of it. We were a team, and this was the final push. During the due diligence process, I found an anomaly. It was a small thing, a series of transactions buried deep within the financials of one of the companies, channeled through an offshore startup with a deliberately opaque ownership structure. It looked like a classic tax evasion scheme, possibly something more. It was a red flag. Any sane analysis would have demanded we halt everything and investigate. I took it to my mentor. He sat in his cavernous office, a portrait of calm and authority. He looked at my data, his face unreadable. He told me I was right to be cautious, that my attention to detail was why I was the best. Then he gave me a perfectly plausible explanation. It was a legacy issue, he said, a remnant of a previous, more aggressive tax strategy that was being phased out. He assured me he had spoken to the other company's CFO, that it was all accounted for, and that raising it formally now would only spook the regulators and jeopardize the entire merger. Sometimes, he said, his voice a low, confidential murmur. You have to know which stones to leave unturned to get the deal across the finish line. He told me to trust his judgment. He was the man I owed my career to. He was a legend in the industry, so I trusted him. I made a note in my private files, a nagging sense of unease in the pit of my stomach, but I didn't include the anomaly in the final risk assessment report. I buried it. I chose ambition over integrity. I signed my name to a document that was, I would later find out, a meticulously crafted lie. The deal closed. The celebration was epic. Champagne flowed, bonuses were paid out, and my name was spoken with a new level of reverence in the halls of the firm. My bonus was a life-changing sum of money. We bought a summer house in the Hamptons. We upgraded our insurance policies to cover our new, more valuable assets. My wife was happy. The silence at the dinner table was replaced with excited chatter about architects and interior designers. I had delivered. I had won. For 6 months, I lived the life of a king. The unease about the deal faded, buried under a mountain of wealth and accolades. I was untouchable, a golden boy in a city of gold. The first crack appeared not with a bang, but with a quiet, polite email. It was from the firm's compliance department, a routine request for my files on the pharmaceutical merger. I thought nothing of it. I forwarded the files and went about my day. Then came a second email, more pointed this time, asking for any and all communications related to the deal. A week later, 2 men in dark, conservative suits were waiting for me in my office. They weren't from compliance. They were from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They were polite, professional, and utterly terrifying. They asked me about the offshore startup. They asked me why it wasn't in my final report. I gave them the explanation my mentor had given me. I told them he had personally vetted it. They listened, their faces impassive, and then they handed me a subpoena. That was the moment my armor began to crack. I walked out of my office that evening into a world that was subtly different. The air felt colder. The city lights seemed harsher. I went home to my beautiful wife in our beautiful penthouse, and for the first time I felt a tremor of fear. I had spent my life building a fortress of wealth, but I had a sudden, chilling premonition that the walls were about to come crashing down. I told myself it was a mistake, a misunderstanding that would be cleared up. I hired the best lawyer my money could buy. I was the victim, a pawn in a larger game, but deep down I knew. I knew that in that one moment of weakness, in that one decision to leave a stone unturned, I had handed my enemies the shovel they would use to bury me. The world I had mastered was about to turn on me, and I was utterly, terrifyingly unprepared for the brutality of its vengeance. The speed of the fall was breathtaking. It was like being in a car crash in slow motion. You see every horrifying detail, but you are powerless to stop it. My life, once a symbol of vertical ascent, became a case study in terminal velocity. The day I was fired, I walked into the office and knew instantly that something was wrong. The normal morning buzz was absent. People avoided my gaze, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. I was summoned to the 30th floor, to the office of a senior partner I barely knew. My mentor wasn't there. The firm's top lawyer was. The conversation was brief, brutal, and stripped of all humanity. They told me that an internal investigation had uncovered gross negligence and potential criminal misconduct in my handling of the merger. They said I had deliberately concealed material information, exposing the firm to massive legal and financial risk. My protests were met with a cold, impenetrable wall of corporate doublespeak. I mentioned my mentor, how he had personally instructed me to stand down on the anomaly. The lawyer simply raised an eyebrow and said, "We have no record of any such instruction. We do, however, have your signature on the final report." I was being thrown to the wolves. It was a clean, surgical excision. I was the scapegoat, the designated sacrifice to appease the regulators and protect the men at the top. My mentor had used my ambition and my trust in him as a weapon against me. He had set me up, and he had done it perfectly. A security guard, a man who had greeted me by name every morning for 5 years, escorted me back to my office. He stood silently as I packed my personal effects into a small cardboard box. My photos of the family, a stupid coffee mug my daughter had painted for me, a few books, the symbols of a life that was already beginning to feel like it belonged to someone else. As I was walked out of the building past the silent, staring faces of my colleagues, I felt a sense of unreality, of dislocation. This wasn't happening to me. I was the master of this universe, not its victim. The humiliation was a physical burn. The next blow came 24 hours later. I was at a cafe trying to gather my thoughts when my credit card was declined. I tried another, declined. A cold dread washed over me. I called my private banker, a man who used to treat me like royalty. His voice was clipped formal. He informed me that due to the ongoing investigation and at the request of federal authorities, all my assets had been frozen. My checking accounts, my savings, my entire stock portfolio. The vast digital fortune I had spent my life accumulating had vanished with a single keystroke. The numbers were still there on a screen somewhere, but they were no longer mine. The fortress had been breached and its treasury had been seized. That night the story broke. My name and picture were all over the financial news networks. Wall Street analyst accused in massive fraud scheme. They used a photo of me from a charity gala, smiling, holding a glass of champagne. I looked arrogant, guilty. The media narrative was set. I was the villain, a symbol of corporate greed and corruption. My lawyer warned me not to speak to the press, to say nothing, so I hid. I hid in my penthouse, the curtains drawn, the television off, as the world outside tore my reputation to shreds. The calls started, first from reporters, then from so-called friends. These weren't calls of support. They were fishing expeditions, morbid curiosity disguised as concern. They wanted the inside scoop, the gossip from the center of the implosion. I quickly learned to stop answering the phone. The true friends, the ones I had known before the money, before the armor, I had neglected them for years. I was too ashamed to call them now. I was an island and the tide was rising. The reaction of my wife was the blow that shattered me. When I first told her about being fired, she was angry, but it was a pragmatic anger. She was already strategizing, talking about which lawyers to hire, how to manage the public relations. She saw it as a problem to be solved, another complex deal to be navigated. But when the accounts were frozen, when the material reality of our situation sank in, her pragmatism curdled into something else. Fear. And then contempt. The woman who had stood beside me at a dozen black tie events, the perfect corporate wife, was completely unprepared for a life without a safety net. Our marriage, I realized, was the ultimate insurance policy, and she had just discovered its coverage had lapsed. The argument started, quiet and venomous at first, then escalating into raw, desperate screaming matches that echoed through the vast, empty rooms of our apartment. She accused me of being a fool, of being reckless, of destroying her life. It was all about what I had done to her social standing, to her future. There was no us in her accusations. There was no partnership. I was a failed investment, a stock that had crashed to zero, and she was furious about her loss. I tried to explain that I had been framed, that I was innocent. But innocence was an abstract concept that didn't pay the mortgage or the private school tuition. She looked at me and saw not a husband in crisis, but a liability. The children became weapons in our Cold War. She told me I was a disgrace, an embarrassment to them. She started keeping them away from me, taking them on long outings, creating a buffer of activity and distance. My son, who was old enough to understand the whispers and see the news, started looking at me with a new expression in his eyes, confusion tinged with shame. He was ashamed of his own father. The final, fatal conversation happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The city outside was a blur of gray. The foreclosure notices had started to arrive. The co-op board was threatening to evict us. The creditors were circling. She stood in our cavernous living room, surrounded by Louis Vuitton suitcases. She was dressed not for a gala, but for travel, in a simple, elegant outfit that screamed quiet wealth, a ghost of the life we used to have. She didn't cry. Her voice was steady, chillingly calm. She told me she was taking the children to her parents' house in California. She said she needed to protect them from the toxic environment, from the media, from me. She said her lawyer would be in touch. The word divorce wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp as a guillotine. I begged, I pleaded. I have never felt so pathetic, so utterly stripped of dignity. I promised I would fix it, that I would clear my name, that I would get the money back. I was making promises with a currency I no longer possessed. She just looked at me with a cold pity. "It's too late," she said. "You don't get it. Even if you are innocent, you are a scandal. You are radioactive. Our life, the one we built, is over. I have to salvage what I can for the children." She was salvaging her life, cutting away the diseased part, which was me. I stood there, paralyzed, as she walked out of the room. I listened to the small, final sounds of her departure, the quiet click of the suitcases being rolled across the marble floor, the soft whoosh of the elevator doors, the final, deafening silence she left in her wake. I was alone. Alone in a $10 million apartment I no longer owned, surrounded by art I could no longer sell and furniture that would soon be seized. I was a king in a kingdom that had been conquered, sitting on a throne of debt and shame. The armor was gone, stripped from me piece by piece. The man underneath was someone I didn't even recognize, weak, terrified, and utterly, completely alone. The silence in the penthouse was a physical presence. It pressed in on me, amplifying the sound of my own ragged breathing. The fall wasn't over. I had a horrifying feeling that I hadn't even hit the ground yet. Hitting the ground is not a single event. It's a series of impacts, each one harder than the last, breaking you in new and inventive ways. The first impact was the eviction. The legal process was swift and merciless. Men in cheap suits came with clipboards and documents, their faces devoid of empathy. They were simply executing a transaction, repossessing an asset. The asset was my home. I was given 48 hours to vacate. Packing was a surreal experience. What do you take with you when you're falling from the 54th floor? I couldn't take the expensive art or the designer furniture. I took a few changes of clothes, my personal documents, and the small box of mementos from my office. Everything else, the entire physical manifestation of my success, I left behind for the creditors to fight over like hyenas on a carcass. I walked out of that building for the last time, not with a briefcase, but with a duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I was no longer a resident. I was a ghost, haunting the scene of my own life. I had nowhere to go. My parents were gone, and my wife's family now saw me as a contagion. I called one of the few friends I had from before my Wall Street days, a guy who taught high school history and lived in a small apartment in Queens. The shame of making that call was a burning coal in my throat. He didn't hesitate. He just told me his couch was mine for as long as I needed it. Sleeping on that lumpy couch in a small room that smelled of old books and chalk dust was a lesson in humility. The sirens of the city sounded different from this vantage point, closer, more desperate. I was no longer observing the chaos from above. I was in it. The legal battle was a slow-motion nightmare. My expensive lawyer had dropped me the moment he realized I could no longer pay his astronomical fees. I was assigned a public defender, an overworked, well-meaning young woman who looked at my case file with a kind of weary disbelief. She was used to dealing with petty criminals, not disgraced Wall Street analysts. To the legal system, my guilt was a foregone conclusion. The evidence against me, a carefully curated selection of emails and my own signature on the final report, was damning. My claims of being framed by my mentor were dismissed as the desperate excuses of a guilty man. My mentor, of course, was untouchable. He had lawyered up with the best team the firm's money could buy, and he had thrown up a firewall of silence. He was cooperating with the investigation, his lawyers said in a press statement, a model corporate citizen helping to root out a lone bad apple. The bad apple was me. I needed a job, any job. My resume, once a golden ticket, was now a liability. The moment any prospective employer Googled my name, the interview was over. The polite rejections piled up. I was toxic, a brand name for failure and disgrace. My friend, the history teacher, saw the desperation in my eyes. He made a call to his brother-in-law who ran a small fleet of delivery vans. It wasn't a glamorous job. It was a graveyard shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., delivering crates of baked goods to restaurants and cafes across the city. The pay was minimum wage, paid in cash at the end of each week. I took it. My first shift was a descent into a new circle of hell. My world had shrunk from a corner office to the cramped, stale-smelling cab of a delivery van. My colleagues were men from the margins of society, immigrants, ex-cons, people for whom this was not a fall from grace but a step up. They didn't know who I was, and I didn't tell them. I was just the new guy, the one who didn't talk much. The physical labor was punishing. Lifting heavy crates, navigating the dark, deserted streets of the city, dealing with surly, short-order cooks. My body, softened by years of sedentary office work, screamed in protest. My hands, once accustomed to the smooth finish of a Mont Blanc pen, became calloused and raw, but there was a strange purity to the work. It was simple. It was honest. There was no ambiguity, no moral gray areas. You lift the crate, you deliver it, you get paid. For 8 hours a night, I was too exhausted to think about my ruined life. I was just a body, moving through the darkness, performing a task. This was my new reality. Days spent sleeping on a couch, trying to help my public defender build a case with no resources. Nights spent hauling bread across the city, my muscles aching, my mind numb. My only connection to my old life, to my children, was through a series of cold, formal emails from my wife's lawyer. She was filing for divorce on the grounds of financial malfeasance and moral turpitude. She was seeking sole custody of the children. A supervised visit was arranged. It took place in a small, windowless room in a family services building, a neutral, sterile environment designed to contain conflict. A social worker sat in the corner, taking notes. My children looked at me like I was a stranger. My son was sullen, refusing to meet my eyes. My daughter, too young to understand the details but old enough to sense the tension, was quiet and scared. My wife wasn't there. She had sent them with her mother, who looked at me with undisguised hatred. I tried to talk to them, to ask about their school, their friends. But my questions felt hollow, pathetic. I had brought them small, cheap toys I had bought with my cash earnings. My son looked at the plastic action figure with contempt. He was used to the latest gaming consoles, to skis, to ponies. I was offering him a piece of plastic. I was a failure in his eyes, not because of some abstract financial crime, but because I could no longer provide the lifestyle to which he was accustomed. The hour was over in what felt like a minute. As they were led out of the room, my daughter turned and looked at me, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking confusion. "When are you coming home, Daddy?" she asked. The social worker gently guided her out before I could answer. I sat in that empty room for a long time after they left, the sound of her question echoing in the silence. It was the moment I hit rock bottom. I had lost my career, my wealth, my home, my wife. But in that room, I realized I was losing my children. And that was a loss I would not accept. Something shifted in me that day. The despair, which had been a paralyzing fog, began to burn away, replaced by a cold, hard rage. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to fight. Not for my money or my reputation. I didn't care about that world anymore. I was going to fight for the truth. I was going to fight for my children. I was going to clear my name, not so I could return to my gilded cage, but so that one day my children would know that their father was not a criminal. He was a fool, yes. He was arrogant and blind, but he was not a thief. That night after my shift, I didn't go to sleep. I went to the public library. I got a library card and sat down at a public computer. I had no access to my old files, no resources, no powerful friends. All I had was my memory, my understanding of the system that had destroyed me, and a burning, righteous anger. My war had begun. It was a war I would fight from the margins, a ghost in the machine, armed with nothing but a public library computer and the desperate strength of a man with nothing left to lose. The public library became my new office, my war room. Its silence was a comfort after the noise of the delivery truck and the shared chaos of my friend's apartment. It was a democratic space. My bespoke suit was replaced by jeans and a worn-out sweater, and no one cared. I was just another face in the crowd, another person seeking knowledge or refuge. My quest began with a single, obsessive focus: to reconstruct the deal from memory and publicly available information. I spent every waking hour outside of my job digging. I read through SEC filings, news archives, and corporate press releases, piecing together the public narrative of the merger. It was like assembling a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. The key was the offshore startup, the anomaly I had been told to ignore. I needed to find out who owned it, who benefited from it. This was the loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of deceit my mentor had woven. I taught myself how to navigate the murky world of corporate registries in tax havens like the Cayman Islands and Panama. It was a slow, frustrating process, a labyrinth of shell corporations designed to conceal, not to reveal. I felt like I was punching at smoke. For every corporate veil I pierced, I found another one behind it. My days fell into a rhythm of opposites: the physical exhaustion of my night job, hauling crates in the dark, followed by the mental exhaustion of my day job, chasing digital ghosts through the global financial system. I slept in 4-hour increments, my body running on cheap coffee and sheer willpower. My friend watched me with a growing concern, but he never tried to stop me. He would just leave a plate of food for me, a silent gesture of support that meant more than any words could. The legal case against me was moving forward, a slow-moving train heading for a cliff. My public defender was doing her best, but she was outmatched and under-resourced. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence, all pointing to me. My story about my mentor sounded like a conspiracy theory. Without proof, it was just my word against his, and his word was backed by a billion-dollar corporation. The divorce was finalized. It was a clean cut. I signed the papers without a fight. She got everything that wasn't seized, which was mostly debt and full custody of the children. My visitation rights remained supervised, my status as a father officially reduced to that of a potentially harmful stranger. Each supervised visit was a fresh agony. I tried to connect with my children, but the artificiality of the setting, the watchful eye of the social worker, created an unbridgeable chasm. I felt like I was performing the role of a father, not being one. But I never missed a visit. I showed up every single time, clinging to that 1 hour as the only thing that kept me sane. It was my reminder of what I was fighting for. The breakthrough came not from a sophisticated data search, but from a moment of human connection. One of my coworkers on the delivery route was a man from Haiti, a quiet, dignified man who rarely spoke. One night during our break, we were sharing a thermos of coffee, and he asked me what I did before this. I hesitated, then for some reason I told him a sanitized version of the truth. I told him I used to work in finance and had been wrongly accused of a crime I didn't commit. He just nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. He told me about his life in Haiti, about the corruption, about how powerful men could destroy the lives of ordinary people with a simple lie. He understood, in a way that none of my old friends could, the feeling of being powerless against a corrupt system. His story gave me an idea. The corruption I was fighting wasn't just a corporate issue. It was a human one. The people who ran that offshore startup, they weren't ghosts. They were real people with lives, with digital footprints. I shifted my focus from corporate structures to people. I started searching for the lawyers, the accountants, the fixers in those offshore jurisdictions who specialized in creating these anonymous entities. I spent weeks combing through social media, professional networks, and leaked documents from old financial scandals. And then I found him, a junior accountant based in Panama who was listed on the incorporation documents of a dozen other shady companies. He had a small, unimpressive social media profile, but on it, he had posted a picture from a fishing trip a few years back. In the background of the photo, on another boat, was a man I recognized instantly. It was my mentor. They were in the same place at the same time. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a connection. It was a crack in the firewall. I started digging into this accountant. I found his work history, his professional connections. And through him, I found a digital breadcrumb trail, a series of emails on an obscure, publicly archived message board for financial professionals, where he had discussed, in vaguely coded language, the setting up of the very same offshore entity that had brought me down. And in that thread, he mentioned his client not by name, but by a handle I recognized. It was the same one my mentor used for his personal fantasy football league. It was a stupid, insignificant detail, the kind of detail that no one would ever think to cover up. It was the mistake, the human error in the midst of a perfect corporate crime. I printed everything. The photo, the forum posts, the corporate records. I organized it all into a meticulous timeline. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a pattern. It was a strong, undeniable suggestion that my mentor had a secret, long-standing relationship with the very people behind the fraudulent entity. I took the file to my public defender. She read through it, her initial skepticism slowly turning into a focused intensity. For the first time, she looked at me not as a client, but as a partner. "This is good," she said, her voice quiet with excitement. "This is very good. It's not enough to get the case thrown out, but it's enough to file a motion for discovery. It's enough to start shaking the tree." A few weeks later, something else happened. I was at the library and I got a call from an unknown number. It was my wife. Her voice was strained. She told me our son had a school project where he had to interview someone about their career. He had told his teacher he wanted to interview me. He wanted to know what I really did. She had told him no, that it wasn't a good idea, but he had insisted. He was fighting for me in his own way. She said she didn't know what to do. I told her to let him call me. That evening my phone rang. It was my son. His voice was small, hesitant. He asked me about my old job, and I told him. I didn't use jargon or try to impress him. I told him I worked with numbers, helping companies grow. And then I told him that I had made a mistake, not a crime, but a mistake. I had trusted the wrong person and that I had been paying for that mistake ever since. I told him I was fighting to prove the truth, no matter how long it took. I didn't know if he understood all of it, but he was quiet, listening. And at the end of the call, he said, "I believe you, Dad." Those 4 words were more powerful than any legal victory. They were a lifeline. I went back to my job that night, the smell of stale bread in the van, the ache in my muscles, but I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in years. I had a long way to go. The legal battle would be fierce. Clearing my name was still a distant hope, but I was no longer a ghost. I was a father. I was a fighter. And for the first time since the fall began, I felt a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. I had lost a world, but I was slowly, painfully finding myself. My life was no longer about a scoreboard of wealth, but about the simple, profound victory of truth and the unconditional love of a son. And that was a kind of income the stock market could never provide. That's how my story unfolded. But tell me, what's the one red flag you wish you hadn't ignored? Drop it in the comments, and if this story spoke to you, like and subscribe.